Welcome to Public Comment. I'm John Dunbar, former mayor of Yountville.
I'm Alfredo Pedroza, former Napa County Supervisor. Welcome to the porch.
This is where we talk about politics, people, and whatever else is on our mind.
Let's go inside.
What's going on with our tax dollars?
It's a fair question to ask because we're all paying for this.
And government is telling us all these great benefits that we're going to see, and then they don't see them.
But some of our cities are broke.
Okay, Alfredo, what's on today's agenda?
You know, I've been waiting for this moment, John. Government waste is on the agenda today. How does that make you feel?
I couldn't hold you off any longer. Well, and I think it's something that's absolutely appropriate for us to talk about. I think it's more about the inefficiency of government. But if it's waste that you want to talk about, it's waste we'll talk about.
It's government waste, John.
Okay.
Period.
Go
Simple,
for it.
Clear. Look, let me caveat with this. I do think there's some incredible people that work for government. Whether it's at the county level or the city level, you have some people that have made incredible careers. And I wouldn't say they're bureaucrats because I've seen the passion in some of these people. I've seen how they respond to emergencies, and some of them working long hours without worrying whether they were going to get compensated for it because they naturally care for the institution of government. So I'm not talking about that. I think to me, what I look at government waste is whether you're going through a process of submitting an application, the redundancy and the inefficiency of the processes. But also, you know, when you look at how much government, you know, how big government is, right? And you look at, you know, the town and the county, we should talk about how we shared public safety, because that's an example of effective and efficient government services. But I think the public is really looking at, you know, when we pay taxes, and I say we because we're all paying taxes, and you look at the city having its own police department, its own fire department, its own public works department, its own HR department, its own IT department, and you multiply that by 5. That's a lot of administration, right? Admin. And I think the public is wondering, is there a better way to provide services in our county? And I think that, and in our cities, in town. And I think that's a fair and legitimate question.
I'm glad you brought up all the jurisdictions because this, you know, all of our podcasts include, especially this one, it's not just about the county and county government and inefficiencies. We could look at every jurisdiction and find where I believe there can be improvements made in how things are operating, how finances are being spent. And you're right. We need to look at, okay, you've got 1,500 employees at the county, we're plus or minus 1,600. And you've got a $500 million budget. And you've got 500 plus pages of the budget itself. And I did a little research.
You brought notes. I'm sorry.
I brought notes.
Pay attention.
But, you know, 18 department heads. Okay. Maybe that's the right number. Maybe it's too many. Maybe it's not enough for efficiency. And when I think about efficiency, it's how are they interacting? Whether it's at the county level or the individual cities in the town. Are they efficiently communicating? Because I know for a fact that not always. I've seen it happen in Yountville. I've seen it happen at the county and in the cities where there's a disconnect between personnel in their offices, in their departments, but then there's a disconnect between government staff and the public.
Look, it's a classic example of the left hand is not tying to the right hand, right? Something that we can all relate to. And I appreciate your perspective of how the inefficiencies are within government. But when you break it down to something that to me is like real, right? The county budget for sheriff department, I think it's $40 million. City police, $38 million, 132 people. And I'm not picking on these municipalities. It's the city of St. Helena, $7.5 million in public safety. I think the question that we all need to ask is that the best delivery model? And it's not about people, right? Like you and I got to be clear because we know these people, and I don't want you to get an email saying, you know, we're not being sensitive. But it's a fair question to ask because we're all paying for this. And I want to make sure that our tax dollars are helping, you know, create a community that we all want to live in. We want to retire and we want to raise families in. But it's a fair question because I think the example that the county had with the town of Yountville, and you can speak to it better than I can, of how the town of Yountville contracted with the county of Napa for public safety. Your fucking cars said the town of Yountville, but the infrastructure behind it was the Napa Sheriff's Department. And I bet we saved money. I shouldn't say I bet. I know we saved money because you didn't have to have your own police chief. We were able to support you through the Sheriff's Department. And what that meant for a resident of the town of Yountville is you're benefiting because it wasn't costing you, the town of Yountville, as much to have your own law enforcement department because you were getting the benefit of the Sheriff's Department. That's an example of good government, right? Or you tell me if you felt differently.
I totally agree. And as long as I've been there, which was now 26 years ago, and I know it was there prior to that, police and fire were contracted through the county with CAL FIRE, Napa County Fire, having Station 12 right at the edge of town. And it also served the Veterans Home, which was critical. We use the sheriff's office and all that personnel. We have 4 dedicated staff members, a sergeant and 3 deputies, typically would be dedicated to the town of Yountville, but would not be limited to that.
Yeah.
Now, Up Valley, they have chosen to do different modeling and having, for a long time, St. Helena was doing a volunteer fire department. And now they're paying their fire personnel. But they've also wanted to keep their own police department. And there are inherent administrative costs associated with those things that may not equate to a higher level of service.
But the question I would have for you when you were mayor of the town of Yountville, because you were contracting with the county, did you ever feel like you weren't getting this personalized, customized service from that contract with the county of Napa?
Actually, the opposite. I felt like we had much better service and reliability because there's so much infrastructure behind those 4 personnel that are dedicated to Yountville. And when you add the California Highway Patrol having a substation that's shared by our deputies, there's no question that we benefited financially as well as from a public safety service delivery model. There was always somebody there close by to respond to any need we had. Up Valley, it's challenging. I mean, we've seen the challenges for services in the healthcare delivery space to once you get out of the city of Napa and then maybe American Canyon, when you get Up Valley, it has been a challenge to have those services be provided. Fewer people living up there, but still the delivery was a challenge. And so there are government efficiencies absolutely could take place. One of the things that I would hear over and over again was, we want people that are committed to our specific community. We want them to know who we are, and we want them to be there when we need them. And I respect those concerns, but you don't lose those just because you are working with a larger organization like the Sheriff's Office or CAL FIRE, Napa County Fire.
Well, there's a lot of things you and I would want too, but sometimes you can't get it all. And I think we got to break down that fallacy, right? Where I think what the town of Yountville did was show that you can contract out, have better use of your tax dollars without compromising service. And I think that took a level of guts and maturity for those elected leaders to do that. Because you and I know this, we don't need to name them, but some of our cities are broke and that they're holding on to these services because they want brand identity. Guess what? If you don't have the resources to pay for that, you got to pivot and adjust and be smart with your tax dollars. And when your budget is red and red is not a good thing, you have to have the guts so and the maturity to say, we have to do something different. Whether it's public works, right? And again, I'm not attacking people, right? Because I think people that are work for these institutions care deeply. But I know what they're making. I know what the county public works director's making. I know what the director of American Canyon's making in the town. They're making good money. And not to say that they don't deserve it, right? To be clear. But I do believe that if you streamlined and consolidated, you'd probably have more money that's going into our roads to fix our potholes, to improve our sidewalks so that way they don't have a 2-inch lift, right? All the things we heard about when we're campaigning. That's good government. And we have to be careful because now that we're not elected officials, we're saying it's waste. And I think you and I had some of these views while we were there because we pushed for some of this consolidation, right? You and I worked on shared land use when we were talking about annexations in the town of Yountville. So we demonstrated that when we were in office, right? So it's not like we've been enlightened now that we're out of office, but I do think we need to call it out.
Well, I think the collaboration that we saw with the Vine Trail is maybe a good example of how cities in the town and the county can work together. It's not left up to each individual entity. When we saw the first mile of the Vine Trail from the north to the south end of Yountville, there was a misunderstanding basically about who would maintain that. There was no plan for that. So we worked together with all the other jurisdictions and the Vine Trail folks to put a plan together. And now it's a normal partnership to share those costs and share those benefits. And I can see that. We're not talking about eliminating local government in each of the cities, the town, and the county. We're not talking about that
in its entirety, but some reduction wouldn't be bad.
But efficiency is what we're talking about. It's actually to improve the level of service locally, because sometimes government is trying to do everything, and they do everything in an average way instead of doing the core issues in a really good way.
And look, I want to be careful because I'm not saying we need to cut and eliminate all government. But I do think we have to be honest, which is something you've said we want to be here, is just because you reduce government doesn't mean you reduce services, or it doesn't mean that our quality of life suffers, right? I think the opportunity here is to make sure that we're using taxpayer dollars more wisely, right? And I mean that whether you're taxing my mom who's on fixed income or whether you're taxing us, right? I want people to say, I'm willing to tax myself for a community benefit. I think that's what makes Napa different, right? And we pony up when we want to fund the Vine Trail or when we want to buy Skyline Park, right? We have a history of doing the right thing. But I also think government hasn't been self-reflective enough to say, do we need to keep growing? And we only freeze, staff increases. When's the last time you heard in our lifetime that government FTE or government personnel dropped? Have you ever heard of that happening?
Well, positions that don't get refilled eventually disappear in some cases, but you're right. Normally it's frozen on hold until.
And that's my whole point. So when they were frozen, did the service standards drop? They didn't. I think people found a way to keep doing what they were doing. And at the same time, I also think people should get compensated well for doing the job they're doing. But whether it's government, and I'm not saying government needs to operate like a business all the time, but I do think we need to be mindful of how we're spending money. And one of the questions I always asked when I was on the board is how much of our expenses are fixed on employee wages and benefits? And it's a pretty high number. And it's not to say that people don't deserve those salaries. I just think we need to be mindful because we can always justify a position. We can always justify adding more people. The question is, what is that going to do for our community? We want our roads fixed. We want our parks in good order, right? We want good basic services through health and human services offered. But that necessarily doesn't equate to adding more people. And that's really where I hope that people that are elected in elected office now feel comfortable enough to say, you know what, let's make sure we're evaluating that appropriately. Just because the budget says we can afford it doesn't mean we should do it.
One of the priorities that we did for all the years that I was on the council in Yountville was to build reserves. And I think, unfortunately, it should be the norm, but it's the exception. Typically, we're seeing governments that will spend whatever they have because they can. To your point, I think that it also means, well, we can build our personnel and we could say we're going to now be improving the level of service to the community. Are we seeing the level of service go up? And that's where I think people get most frustrated with government, which is, okay, we're now paying higher water rates, and now we're paying a special tax, and now sales tax has gone up, and government is telling us all these great benefits that we're going to see, and then they don't see them.
See, I think that's what is really, pissing off people, where this community is willing to tax themselves, as you illustrated, but the benefits aren't there. And I'm not saying we shift to an incentive model, But I do think, there has to be a way to encourage people to do more, to do better, right? Soccer season's about to start. We go to a local sports store and my son wants some cleats and clearly, he likes the nice ones that are like $200. I'm like, you're 9 years old. You're not getting $200 cleats. But, he got the $100, which is still a lot. I said, but you know what, bud? If you show that you're committed to soccer, you go to practice and the coach is saying you're doing a good job, maybe you'll get those $200 cleats. So it was kind of like an incentive-based model. And I think we got to operate more like that. Even though it's government, it's not like it's incentivizing government to make more money. It's incentivizing government that allows us to invest more in our community. And if we can have better parks, if we can have cleaner streets, if we can have more mental health services, if we can help more homeless people, all that's good. And that's what I'm saying. It's not reducing the spending of government. It's making sure we're effective, to your point, right? And I think that's where I do believe there is waste that happens that can transition to better spend, which makes the overall government more effective and efficient.
Well, there are a couple of different components to this conversation. One is like what we've been talking about, the kind of external efficiency or inefficiency of government and the services being provided. The other issue is internal. And to your point about have positions, how often have they ever been eliminated for budget savings, efficiency? And my concern is when departments don't communicate within a government, whether it's a large government like the county or smaller governments like the cities and the town, if they aren't working together to provide the services that the taxpayers are funding, then that's a real problem. And it's challenging, whether it's a CEO or a city manager or a town manager that is supposed to be monitoring that, managing that. It's so easy to lose the focus, and people are again, we're not going to pick on anybody in particular, but there are people in government that are just going to work to retire with a pension. And,
true statement.
Whether you can like or dislike that, the problem is those people are no longer being effective in their service to the public. And I don't have an answer for what you do about that, other than hopefully you inspire people. And sometimes inspiring is financial, but sometimes it's just seeing what they are delivering, being proud of your work, frankly.
Well, look, you and I know that, with unions, sometimes it's hard to coach people up or coach people out. And I can tell you my philosophy is you coach up or you coach out. When I was in banking, I had one employee, and I still remember this. She was coming in at exactly 9:00. I'm like, you have to be ready to work at 9. I said, but here's the deal. If you don't want to come in, right, then I want to find a different job. And I want to help you find that job. Because the other people that were coming in early and were ready to go, my top performers, they were looking at that as an example of what we did as a company, as myself, as the manager. So I think you have to understand that. And I think for us is, we talked a little bit about the political courage, for elected officials to say, you know what, where can we do better? Where can we consolidate without losing the local identity or control? But I think a message for the staff too is you have a lot of talented staff in these institutions. But at the same time, I hope staff has the courage to say, well, just because we've always done it that way doesn't mean it's a way we should be doing. And just because it's a regulation doesn't always mean it should get implemented if it's allowed not to be implemented. Because I do think some of these regulations were well intended, but some of these things are beyond its useful life. And just because it says it doesn't mean it's right. And I can tell you because I've gone through some things where, to do this, you have to get a permit here, there, and there. I'm like, why? And the answer is, well, that's how we've done it. And that's not an acceptable answer anymore. I think people are allowed to push back and say, look, if I'm doing something that clearly is going to harm the environment, clearly is going to harm my neighbor, clearly is going to create harm, I shouldn't be allowed to do it. But when it's just like, check the box, check the box, check the box, that's not okay. It's costing someone money. And then we complain why normal people can't do it in Napa County. It's because we have this process that's like check the box all the time and we have to pivot.
I think there's a term that's been so, I'll say, overused. It's become almost without real value, and that's transparency. And what I mean by that is the public needs to see what's getting done and done well by local government. Sometimes local government thinks they're getting the word out about whether it's a public works team that, in Yountville, continuing to maintain the highest pavement index, not only in Napa County, but one of the highest in the state, certainly in the Bay Area, because we dedicated our time and money to maintaining the roads. That can be very visible to the public. When you're building infrastructure that's invisible, whether it's underground or a water treatment plant or whatever it is, it's not so visible until your water's discolored and has an odor and you can't drink it.
And that's happening in some of our cities.
It has. And it has lasted for a long time. And that's when people rightfully get very pissed off to say, what's going on with our tax dollars that we can't even get clean drinking water? And there are often legitimate reasons that has happened. But sometimes it is, at least in part, inefficiency and a lack of leadership within the government to prioritize the things that aren't sexy, that aren't visible, because those are the really core services that are the most important. They're just not easy to sell the public because they don't see it.
Well, look, they don't see it. And I think government sometimes...
Until it fails.
Yeah.
And then they see it.
But to your point, though, I think we love to preach on transparency, but our budget book, which is 500 pages in some, isn't very transparent either, right? You got to search and comb through it. And I think that's hard. And I think, again, I don't think it's intended to be that way, but that's just government, right? It's the way we've always done it. Here's chapter and verse. And I think we got to change it. So, for me, look, we've talked about elected officials having courage. We've talked about staff feeling empowered to not accept it's the way we've always done it. But I think our citizens have to step up too and know that you have the power, right? And you can't just say we're going to keep supporting new taxes just because. Well, what do you want to get done? What do you want to see out of it? And I think there's the power of that. And part of what I think is missing, you and I have gone through this. We could have chambers full of people when it's fighting a project. But when it's budget time, when we're approving the budget, the audience is clear. We have more staff people in the freaking chambers than public. And it's how we're going to spend the money. And no one's there. And I think that's part of the disconnect that, gets me going. It's like, here's how we're going to tell you we're going to improve your life or impact your life. And you're not there. And I think you have to step up a little bit more. And I think this is also business leaders that I know you're all busy, but you got to step up and attend these meetings.
Yeah. I'm just smiling because I'm laughing inside about it, because it became almost a running joke when I was mayor. I used to tease our finance director about the number of public workshops we held about the budget leading up to when we were going to finalize the budget, and nobody was ever there. And then sure enough, within a few months of the new fiscal year, somebody's complaining about why are we spending it that way? It's like, are you effing kidding me? But that's just, unfortunately, that's human nature to a degree. But it's really frustrating human nature that there is a partnership that the public has to engage and can't just bitch about the way government is operating or not operating. Engaging is the responsibility of everybody, staff as well as the public. And many people in the public don't see it that way. They just expect the government staff to know what they want, the public wants, and to deliver that without question. But turns out you have difference of opinion in the public, and not everyone wants it spent a certain way. And that complicates the ability to be efficient in government. But it is a partnership where the public needs to participate.
Yeah. Look, I think the government needs to effectively participate, right? And I want to say effective because it's not just showing up, it's getting involved, right? And asking the tough questions. I do think that the quality of life that we have here in Napa Valley is incredible, but it's not guaranteed. And I don't think we can keep spending money the way we're spending money without increasing taxes. So I think something has to give. And I do think we're reaching a point where I think our business side is going to plateau. It's going to shift from growth to sustaining, the business community, and government has to pivot from growth to sustaining. And that's going to push more consolidation, which is okay. We don't all need our own fire department. We all don't need our own police department, our own public works department. Similar to kind of the podcast we had around nonprofits. It's okay to have these discussions because if we don't, we might end up like some of those municipalities that go broke, right? And it's easy to do that, to just kick the can down the curve. You and I won't deal with it, the next person will. It's not about that, right? We care enough to say, there's some red flags here. Let's do something about it. So I don't think government waste should have this negative connotation, right? I think you can frame it better by calling it efficient or inefficiencies. But let's call it for what it is. And I think you and I have to give air to this discussion and give folks the confidence to say, it's okay to ask these questions. It's okay to have this discussion.
I think it's critical because you made me remember when I was president of the League of California Cities and dealing with the pandemic and the impacts to cities when businesses were shut down, which also meant revenues and taxes, sales tax, for example, severely limited. There were so many cities out of the 483 now cities. There were dozens of cities that were headed to bankruptcy. And people, I don't think, understand that's a real thing for cities.
Yeah.
Vallejo went through that. St. Helena, frankly, has been really scarily close to significant financial challenges. They have financial challenges. They need to really be careful because Vallejo happened and it's taking years for them to recover. And it is partly because there is that lack of understanding of revenue, expenses, what's critical needs, what are not critical needs, but wants, and how you spend the money you have. It's not really any different than a household budget. If you don't have the money, you probably shouldn't be spending it beyond your credit card limit.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean just go get another credit card. So I do think that, again, like pretty much all the topics we've launched already, there's a deeper dive that we're going to need to do with what parts of government might be the most beneficial to streamline. And I remember when for a year in Yountville, I was on a committee that worked to reduce the zoning and design review ordinances, dozens and dozens of pages. And if none of us around the table could understand why it was written, we just deleted it.
What a wonderful thing.
And it actually shrunk that ordinance. So we need more of that kind of efficiency internally with all of our local government.
Yeah. And I know we want to wrap up, and I'll just say this. Look, I think we're at a very sensitive point where we've had a good economy that has allowed inefficiencies to exist. We're one recession away from exposing a lot. So to the staff, to the elected officials, to the community, don't let it get there, right? We have time to adjust and pivot. And I agree, there's a lot of deeper dives that we can take, and I hope we do that. But I think the whole point of today was daylighting, showing some of the inefficiencies, but also calling out those that have done it, because there's a lot of good that's happening in our community. And sometimes we don't intentionally pause to showcase that. So to good government, to more effective government.
But and a call to action for the public to participate.
Cheers to that.
Cheers.